Good afternoon. Welcome to today's program, Finding Your Ancestors, Genealogy and the Census. I'm Tom Ankner, the director of the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center at the Newark Public Library. Before we get started, I just wanted to encourage you all to fill out your census forms. Filling out the census is one small but very important thing everyone can do right now to help our city and our communities. If you haven't done so yet, please go to my2020census.gov and fill out the brief questionnaire. The information you provide affects funding for healthcare, transportation, your local schools, and many other needs. Remember, my2020census.gov. It is safe, secure, and confidential. Our guests today are two professional genealogists who regularly use census information in their work. Randi Koenig of Legacy Genealogy Services and Lauren Orenstein of KinFinder NYC will talk about this type of information and why it is so important to people doing family history research. Randi and Lauren, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. So my first question is about the law surrounding the U.S. Census. The personal information provided by people is confidential for decades after the census is taken. How long, can you talk a little bit about that? How long after a census is taken before people can find identifying information on individuals who have completed their census forms? Either one of you can answer that.
You can go ahead, Randy, if you want to take that one.
Thank you. Okay, so hi, Tom. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Thanks for having me. The census records are they're locked for 72 years. And the reason behind that is that most censuses have a year of birth for people as well as their parents' names. So it's a little bit of confidentiality are the reasons behind it. And I believe the initial thinking behind it of the 72 years was that most people on it would already be deceased after 72 years if they were enumerated.
Okay, all right. So none of the personal identifying information that people are providing this year, such as name, address, age, gender, race, and ethnicity tied specifically to them, should be available to the general public until 2092, almost the turn of the next century. Isn't that right? I mean, that's right.
Correct.
Yeah, and the most recent census available now is the 1940 census, because that's the only one that 72 years have passed, right? And then the 1950 census will become available 2 years from now in 2022.
Exactly.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to establish that because I think the premise for this program is how people are how genealogists use personal identifying information. We just want to make it clear to people who are filling out forms that information won't be available, to the public for decades to come. Okay. All right. So what kinds of information do you find in the census? Lauren, why don't you start there? I mean, what kinds of information can you get out of the census that you can't get other places?
Okay, well, first of all, again, thank you so much for having me, for inviting me to speak to everyone today. The information varies from census to census. Very early on, starting with the very first United States Census in 1790, going up through, I believe, the 1840 census, the only listing was the head of the household, generally the man of the house. And then there would be tick marks in various columns to say only how many people in each category lived in that household. And that included family members, employees, and slaves. And there wasn't even necessarily a designation between those, depending. Some census records do delineate between slaves and non-slaves or by race, but they don't name the people. So you have to infer, for example, if it says there's one male in the house who's between 5 and 9 years old, that's probably the child of the head of household, but you don't know that for sure. It could be a grandchild, it could be a nephew, it could be a cousin, it could be a sibling even. Then once you get to 1850 and going forward, everyone in the household is listed by name. Everyone in the family is listed by name, and then it should also include borders, anyone who's living there who might not be related, that kind of thing. And as each census goes on, different pieces of information were found to be useful, different things that were that the government was trying to track. One example I like to use is the 1910 census, which has 2 columns on it, only used for the woman in the household, the wife. She was asked how many children had she given birth to and how many are currently alive. They were trying obviously to track infant mortality. So that's a great piece of information for genealogists, but it's only in 1910. So, you know, everyone has different pieces of information, but certainly being able to see a snapshot of who's living in a particular household at any given time is incredibly useful to genealogists, among, as I said, many other pieces of information.
Yeah. One of the really useful things I found in the 1900 census is that they would ask the month that someone was born. Usually they would, and so you had actually a month of birth, which was fantastic. And they didn't do that. I don't think they did that in any other census. That was fantastic. It's the 1900 census. Randi, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think the thing that I would like to add is, as you said, it's the month and year of birth for that census. It's not always correct. So one of the things to be careful about with census information is who is the source, and not all censuses would say exactly who was providing the information. So it's a good starting point for research, but it's not, you know, it may not be 100% accurate, but it can help people to hone in on their families and doing their family research.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point, Randi. Okay, so we actually went into Lauren actually talked about some of the information that was asked in earlier censuses. Now there's, you know, I just looked over the 1940 census sheet yesterday, and there was a tremendous amount of information that was asked back then that's not asked today, you know, because I filled out my census form a couple of months ago. So like the 1940 census asked, you know, birthplace, parents' birthplace, occupation, income, whether you own or rent your home, level of education you reached, if you were looking for work or were engaged in public emergency work. I'm not sure what they meant by public emergency work, whether they meant, are you a cop or a firefighter, or maybe you worked for a New Deal agency. I'm not sure what they meant.
Yeah. Perhaps.
It was, I'm sorry?
The WPA Act.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of, because there were the WPA workers.
Yeah.
The New Deal Act.
So, but today's, the census, the 2020 census asks much less information. I mean, there's really bare bones. Do either of you have any idea about why the type of information or the amount of information asked in the decennial census is less today than it was, you know, 72 years ago, almost 80 years ago now? Or it was 80 years ago, actually. Yeah.
I personally don't know. I don't know how they arrived at the questions. I know that they were, that there was some controversy over whether to ask people if they were immigrants or not, you know, if they were documented or legal immigrants. But beyond that, I don't know how they arrived at the questions. Though I remember the last census. I don't remember the questions that were asked 10 years ago, but I remember thinking that it was a very small number of questions as well. And I felt sorry for the genealogists of the future, because there's not a lot of information on the censuses.
Yeah, I completely agree, Randi. You know, we as genealogists have a very different way of looking at the census. Then, of course, the purpose had nothing to do with genealogy and still has nothing to do with genealogy. The purpose of the census is for representation it's to determine, how many Congress people each district gets, how district lines are drawn, and to generally understand how, what the makeup is of each area of our country. So I think the choice of questions, it has to be tailored each time to what the particular interests are, I guess, of, what kind of information they want to gather. I mean, to me, I'd like it to be much, much longer, and, for example, if they had asked that question I mentioned from 1910 about how many children living and how many did the women have, I'd like that question to be asked every time, because it can really prove useful. But that's not the reason for the census. And obviously that's what we have to keep in mind.
And Tom, that may be her favorite question, but my favorite question is how old were you when you got married? So I can figure out the year that somebody got married, which is on the 10 and the 30. They ask it a little differently, but it's basically the same question.
Yeah. Yeah, they, I guess they don't really have genealogists in mind, or people searching their own family history in mind when they compose these questions. Yeah, I wanted to actually ask about that question, about the immigration question. Now, that was a common question on earlier censuses, if you were a naturalized citizen or not, or if you're and where your parents were born. Now, there was a lot of controversy over that, and some of it was based on people's feelings about the current administration, or, et cetera, and what would be done with that information if it were given. Genealogists have a very different view of that type of information, maybe because you're looking at that information decades after it's collected. Can you talk a little bit about that, a little bit more about the feeling about that immigration question, that naturalized citizen question?
So I'll take this one. So from a genealogical perspective, understanding what year somebody started their naturalization process, or depending on the census, the older census, it will say what year somebody immigrated, and then we know that they can start their immigration process, which is declaration of intent, starting a year after they've been here, and then they can fully naturalize within 7 years. And depending on the census, it may say PA or AL or citizen, and it gives you the ability, and again, it's the year of the census, and if they're all tweaked a little differently, it will give us an idea of, rather than a family saying they're just from Italy, you may be able to get to a specific census, which will then, specific naturalization, which will then have the person's birthplace. So we'll know exactly where they came from in Italy, for instance. So it's really, really valuable. And, especially, we had a call the other day where we had somebody was looking for her ancestor whose name was Sam Gold. And that's got to be like John Smith. So how do you know you have the right Sam Gold? So first thing is you'd want to make sure you have the right census, that you've got the person living at the right address. And then from those census records, you can narrow down on the naturalization papers, the naturalization documentation.
Okay. That's good. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about how genealogists use the census. When do you look for census information for one of your clients, Lauren? Is there a specific type of question you get that you would think, well, this is a good place to look in the census for?
For me, the census records are really one of the very first places I start, but that's to get an overview. I mean, the way I describe to clients is, the first thing I need is everything, all the information you have. And the second thing I need to do is I need to dig in and get to know the family, so that I understand how these people are related to each other, and I really feel like I get to know them in a certain way. But census records, vital records, that's births, marriages, and deaths, as well as naturalizations. And to me, it's an imperative way to get an overview of the family. But there are times that a particular census is crucial to answer a specific question, whether it's if a particular family member had come here by a certain date, or where someone was living at a particular time, if they were living as a boarder in someone's household, or they were living with relatives. There were certain cases, or even to determine when someone was born, or when they died, in order to narrow down someone, if someone comes to me and says, well, I don't know when this ancestor died, it was sometime between 1915 and 1940. Well, you can't look, if it's a common name at all, you can't look anywhere for that, for that wide a gap. But if you can use census records to narrow down that time period, then you can, have a much more efficient search. So it varies a lot, but it's a crucial part of the work, definitely.
Anything to add, Randy?
No, I too start. I also start with the census record. I find it really gives you very good underpinnings for the family.
Okay, all right, good. Okay, so where do you search the census? Do you use ancestry.com? Do you use some other database? I don't think anybody uses the microfilm anymore, I don't think, right? So, I mean, where do you go, Randy, where do you go to search the census?
Initially, I guess it depends on what tools I have available. I personally have an Ancestry subscription. I may start an Ancestry, because I may possibly start by building a tree in Ancestry. But if I don't find the census indexed, in Ancestry, I will look in Family Search, because they're often not indexed or they're not transcribed by the same person. So you may get different spellings. So for instance, I was looking at a family name that ended in an N, an EN, and I found it as an ER on Family Search. And they do tie back and forth to each other, but they have their own sets of indexes. So that would be the initial way I would look for it. The other way that you can look for censuses is you can look by address, and Steve Morse has some really good tools about how to do those. So you can look up the enumeration district, or you can look by street names. So if you have a family address, you can back into it that way. The other thing you can also do with Steve Morse is he searches across Ancestry and Family Search in a little bit of a different way, because remember, in the U.S., spellings were not something that people really held on to until the 70s. Names were often phonetically altered. Even a name as simple as Smith might be spelled S-M-Y-T-H-E, S-M-I-T-H, S-M-I-D-T. It's all Smith. So, you think the family name is Smith, but, you see S-M-I-D-T, which is pronounced Smith, and it's not on the census. You wouldn't find it in a census as Smith, with that spelling. So, it gives you a little bit broader search engines.
And if I can just add quickly, when you mentioned we're not looking at microfilm anymore, we aren't looking at microfilm physically, but when Randy was talking about searching by the enumeration district, it is essentially what we're doing. We're paging through the enumeration district page by page, the same way we did on microfilm years ago. because sometimes it is the only way to find if a certain family was living at the address you think they were living at, because sometimes it's just, no matter what you do, it's not going to come up on the various search engines, whether it's because it was transcribed so poorly, or it may be that the names are mangled on the form itself. And the spellings, the versions of the names, and then, you know, once you can really get to that address, you can see if they were there or not there.
Can either of you tell a story about working for a client in which census data led to a major discovery for that client?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, is this the same client? Is this?
No. So I do a lot of probate work, and I had a client whose family was living in the South, and from looking at the census record, I could tell that the family owned the property, and there were roughly, I'm going to say 16 children. And every census, the children's names were different. And I kept saying, well, I know from the census that they own this property. And if I can figure out when the family got out of the property, it will help me to understand what the names of the children really are. Because if you're familiar with any type of Southern genealogy, you'll know that there's house names, street names, nicknames, and depending on who was being asked the question, the names were all different. I have family members from this particular family that, you know, they had 3 names. They had names that their children didn't even know they were ever called. And I was tearing my hair out at one point, but, you know, especially because I'm talking about a family that was, the oldest was born in 1878 in an area outside of Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina did not require vital records, which is, as Lauren said, birth, marriages, or deaths until 1915. So you have almost 30 years worth of, you know, birth certificates that you're not going to find. And I did find the 1880 census, and I found that oldest child living there at age 2. So I knew for a fact that he was in fact born in 1878, and that was the oldest child. And the youngest was, of course, born about 1914. So, and it was a number of different wives, and there was, you know, a lot of different reasons why it was so complicated. But the end of the story is, the real estate did ultimately help me, because I'm going to call it the deed out to keep the story from being any more complicated. The deed out did name all of the children. So all 18 children were named, and it did help me to decipher who everybody was on those census records.
Okay. Do you have a story, Lauren, you'd like to share?
Trying to think of a particular one that might pop out, but not too long ago, I was working on a property matter, trying to track what happened to a particular woman. She was married once, I think about 1909. She was widowed 6 months later. She married again, had a child, was divorced, I think, by about 1920. I think as I recall, I had her in the 1920 census living with her son, and her husband wasn't there. I knew he was off, married somebody else. And then the question was, we knew what ultimately happened to the child, but the client needed, in order to be able to clear title for the property, he needed to verify what happened to the mother, to the child's mother. I found no marriage records, and I found no death records that I could identify as her. Now, of course, I didn't know if she had she was using her maiden name, her first married name that she'd had for 6 months, but you know, you never know. People could do anything. Or using her second married name, or using a name completely, you know, another completely different name, a fourth name. In the end, I had an address for the son from, I think from his marriage record of, I want to say 1938. So I looked at the 1940 census for that address, and in the end was able to determine that the family named Finkelstein at that address, that I had not heard of any Finkelsteins connected to this family at all, but it turns out she married someone named Finkelstein. There was no civil record, no civil marriage record, but they were there, husband and wife, and I saw that the son was there as well. But I wasn't going to find that without paging through and looking specifically at that address. And, you know, there was no other record that would prove that, that there was a marriage, that there was any connection. So that was crucial.
Okay, oh, great. All right, those are good, both good stories. Okay, so there have been other censuses in the United States other than the federal census. So many states did their own censuses. New Jersey had a census for several decades. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Randy?
Sure. So New Jersey census are, there were 4 of them that I know of. It's 1885, 1895, 1905, and 1915. There a lot, most of them are available on Family Search, but there is a really good chart on jgsny.org that tells you exactly which counties are covered for the state census. So it gives the state census has very similar information to the information that's on federal censuses, but they're in skip years. So the regular census are on the that would be 1910, 1920. These are on these census. The state censuses are on the 5s. That's what New Jersey would be, and that's where you will find them.
Yeah, the New Jersey census actually started in 1855. The earlier ones are not online, and most of the 1874 census was lost. There were only 4 counties that that records are extant. Luckily, Essex County is one of them. You're in Essex County. But yeah, so Lauren, New York also did a state census as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the New York State Census started in 1855 and then ran, there are a few gaps. There's 1855, 65, 75, then 92, 1892, then 1905, 15, and 25. 1925 is the last one. And as Randy said, those give similar information, though they're much shorter. You know, there aren't as many columns of information as there are on the federal census records for the most part. Sometimes they can give you a piece of information that you're not going to get anywhere else. For example, I was working on a family recently living in upstate New York, a early, probably colonial family in upstate New York. And I was trying to tie the ancestors back into Revolutionary War patriots. And these records for the 1855 census specifically gave not just the place of birth, which is generally the state or the country, but gave the county of birth if it was in New York. So I was able to see that one particular family, they may have been living, I think, in Hamilton County. They were originally from a county closer to the Great Lakes. So they had moved quite a distance. And I could see that the father in the house was from this distant county, but the mother was locally born. And then the children were all born in that area. I think it was, like I said, Hamilton County. So that can be very, very useful. Then as it gets later, 1905, 15, and 25, there's a notation, as we have in the federal census, for naturalization, but in 05, 15, and 25, you can sometimes get very, very lucky and get a year of naturalization in that box, and sometimes even the court of naturalization. So it might say something like 1923 Kings, and then you know that the naturalization was done in Brooklyn in 1923. That piece, interestingly, I've found to be extremely reliable. It's very interesting because I think, as Randi mentioned earlier, census records, you have to take a lot of it with a grain of salt, sometimes several pounds of salt, because you're relying on information that was given to the census taker by who? We don't know who. I tell the story all the time that you have to remember that what was supposed to happen wasn't always what happened. The census taker was required to get this information from either the man or woman of the house. So they weren't supposed to get it from the 5-year-old child or anything like that. But they were also supposed to revisit that house as many times as it took to find someone home who would give this information. And they didn't necessarily want to. So you have the nosy neighbor next door, you know, they knock on the door, nobody's home. And the nosy neighbor opens the door and says, "Don't worry about it. I can help you. You don't have to come back. I know all about them." Well, then you end up with children of all the wrong ages, all the wrong names, everything's wrong. But they didn't have to come back and they didn't care. So it's important to remember that too.
It's a human endeavor. Yes.
Exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to add to that. So on the flip side, you know, the census taker was paid to finish the census, obviously, right? But on the flip side of it, I'm a woman, I'm home, I've got 5 kids running around the house. The census taker shows up, he's smoking a cigar or whatever it is that he's doing, and he's asking me a zillion questions, and you know, I just want him out of my house. I have things I have to do. I need him out of there. You know, so for me, it's like, I want him out, you know, and I'll say yes to anything he says, you know. And one other piece to that too is back to the naturalization piece. They weren't asking people to prove that they were naturalized. They would ask them if they were naturalized. So some people would just file their declaration of intent and didn't understand that they didn't actually finish their naturalization. So on the census, it may say that they were naturalized, but they may not have been completely through the process. Some of it's about how the question is asked and who's answering. So
Okay.
just to, you know, enforce what Lauren said, but in a little twist.
Yeah. And then obviously what I also should have mentioned is there's always language issues, cultural issues. You know, if the person coming to your door is not, you know, doesn't understand your accent, or you're suspicious of them because they, you know, they're from somewhere else, they're out from outside your neighborhood, they're not somebody you know, you don't want them there. You can also have a lot of, as Randi mentioned, you know, a woman's home, she's got 5 children, they're all running around, and she's not going to tell the census taker that her husband left. She's not going to say that. It would be embarrassing, and she doesn't know who this person is. She's not going to divulge that sort of information to him or her, you know, whoever it was at the door. So, you know, it's all these different things you have to keep in mind, but, you know, it's a lot of different factors.
And Lauren just reminded me of a really good story. So there's a guy, he was an actor, and he clearly died in 1918. I know he died in 1918. There were newspaper articles written about him, and his second wife was a prima ballerina. So she was this little thing and just absolutely gorgeous. Well, he died in 18. He's listed on the 30 census. because she was probably home by herself. And, here's this gorgeous little ballerina, and, she's scared. She's telling him her husband's coming home. I mean, we know he was clearly dead for 12 years. So, there's a lot you can find some interesting things sometimes.
So I'm just going to ask you a few questions we have here in the chat box. Somebody asked, how often are people skipped or whole streets skipped? Have you run into that a lot?
Absolutely, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because as I said, the census taker was supposed to get it done. But what does that mean, get it done? You go back to the same apartment a few times and they don't answer. How hard do you really want to push at this? And then in terms of streets, I know it's happened to Randy, it's happened to me several times that there are addresses that you just can't find it. It's just not there. Paging through ED after ED after ED, and it's just not there.
And one of the other things along those lines as well is that there are, I'm also suspect that sometimes the husband goes and does the census and he comes home and he puts it on the table and his wife looks at it and she's like, you're not handing it in like that. So she rewrites it. So, which is another way for, information to then not be firsthand, it becomes secondhand, because as she's sitting and rewriting it, she's not, she thinks she understands what his writing says. So, because I've seen some census that are just way too beautiful. It's the same handwriting all the way down, beautiful, everything's all lined up, so it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So someone asked, is information today retained in a computer and therefore my home information does not need to be updated each time? I guess that's a question that person is asking. Well, I mean, they'd have to ask the address every 10 years anyway, because people aren't necessarily going to live in the same place 10 years from now that they're, that they were living, they're not necessarily going to live in the same place in 2020 that they did in 2010.
My census, the census that came this year did not have my name on it. It was addressed to resident, to the address.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, and I got several of them in the mail because, I guess they figure if they address one to resident, one to me, and one to my husband, that maybe they hit one,
Yeah.
law of averages. But certainly you need to fill it out every 10 years. It's not something they don't have you in the system from 10 years ago and they'll use that. They don't know you're in the same place or anything. Yeah.
Or even still alive necessarily.
Right, exactly.
And they're also not comparing your information. So if you said that you were 19 10 years ago and you say you're 39 now instead of 29, nobody's challenging that.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Someone asked, what can you use prior to the census records? I think that was asked when I asked you the question about why you would go to the census as opposed to something else. Is there something you use prior to census records? I'm not. Either one of you can answer that question.
I think the best thing prior to census, and it's going to depend on, at least for me, it depends on which ethnicity people are. So at that point, you get into church records and newspapers. You're not gonna find, and real estate records. You can look at real estate records as well. That'll give you head of house, but it won't give you, if somebody owned a house, it won't give you how many children were in the house. The other thing you can also use is there are old probate records out there. So that would be something, because that would name all the children and they exist in a lot of different states and a lot of different countries.
Yeah. Somebody asked about the agricultural and manufacturing parts of the census. I think that's that's not really part of the decennial census. That's a separate survey that the Census Bureau does, I believe, or the different censuses, different surveys that the Census Bureau does. Okay, for those censuses without an address, for example, the 1870 census, how did the enumerator, or like, I have to scroll back up to that, just a minute. For those censuses without an address, how did the enumerator walk through a district? I'm looking at Newark Ward 10 and attempting to identify a street if possible. I've used directories, but is there an easier method? So I guess before their cities necessarily use street addresses. How do you, you mentioned going through enumeration districts. I think that's where you would find someone, right?
I think city directories are very important for that. I definitely understand the issue. I've had many situations where I'm trying to get an address for someone that I have on the 1860 or the 1870 census, and those don't contain addresses. You definitely want to cross-reference it with city directories. Also, again, you want to look at property records. If people might have owned property, you want to find out, you know, for example, if you know a family, I had an issue with this not long ago, family living at an address in Brooklyn. They lived at that address for many, many years. It turned out they did own that property. So then the question becomes, when did they purchase it? And if they purchased it before or in 1870 and the ward matches up for the right area in Brooklyn, then it probably is that same address in 1870. But again, it's, and the same goes for vital records, may give you an address, but you know, finding vital records that early isn't always a given, but sometimes you can get lucky and find, you know, if you found a marriage from 1870, then you might get an address off of that.
Okay. My colleagues is telling me the person was asking about the 1870 census, which apparently didn't list streets.
Yeah,
I hadn't really.
Did not.
Yeah.
Yeah, before 1880, they didn't list streets. None of them did. And the question of how did the enumerator walk through the districts, I don't know if they had a prescribed route or if they kind of walked as they felt like it. I always like seeing when I'm paging through an ED, trying to figure out how the person was walking through the district. When we do have addresses, you know, for later census records. And it's funny because you can see that some people were very careful to walk all the way around a square block, stop and start on the next one. And other people clearly didn't care. Maybe they sneaked through the district, or maybe they, you know, did one side of one street, crossed the street, did the other side. I think, yeah, it was about getting it done. I don't know that it was a particular route.
Okay, so, does anyone else have any other questions? You can just type them in the chat room. It doesn't look like, so I think that it doesn't look like anybody else has any questions. So I think we're going to wrap this up. Thank you, Randy and Lauren, for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I just wanted to tell everyone about other events we have coming up. Tonight, we will be showing a one-man play by Jesse Bernstein. Bernstein's grandfather was the personal physician and good friend of Newark gangster Longies Willman in the 1950s. Ethics of the Fathers, aka The Gangster and the Grandpa, explores Bernstein's relationship with his father and his Jewish identity. That is tonight at 7:00 p.m. on Zoom. Check the calendar on the Newark Public Library's website, npl.org, for more details. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.